Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a consultant chartered psychologist in the UK. I'm absolutely fascinated by anything human behaviour, but particularly criminal human behaviour. What makes a person do what they do? Whether it's killing, murdering, just committing a crime. I'm fascinated to know what's gone on in their background and what their personality type is to make them commit that crime. Before I start, if I could please ask you to like and subscribe, that would be really great. And please feel free to put some comments below. It's always interesting to see what people have to say. In today's episode, which is a podcast episode, it does involve the murder of two very young children, so listener viewer caution is advised. It concerns the case of Lianne Smith, who in Spain, she was a British national, but she would move to Spain for various reasons that you'll hear. And she would ultimately kill her two young children. She had four children, two much older and two younger, and she would kill the two youngest children. It's a desperately sad episode, and it almost sounds very simple, but it isn't. No murder is ever simple. In October 1992, a young single mum, recently divorced from her first husband, with two small children, was looking to start again. This was way before the time of internet dating, and agencies still very much had their part to play. She signed up with a local agency, and very soon this young mum, Lianne Smith, would meet Martin Smith. What a coincidence, they probably thought. We both share the same surname. This was meant to be. What Lianne Smith didn't know about Martin Smith was he was a paedophile and he was a narcissist. And before long, Lianne was firmly in his grip, as were her two children, Sarah and Chris. The family would very quickly move in together and would subsequently have lots of different moves. Martin Smith from the beginning was abusive to Lianne Smith's two children. She turned a blind eye. Apparently at one point, when young Chris, her son, had two black eyes, she said to Chris, "Well, just don't annoy him then." She could see no fault with the man that was beating her children. And he wasn't only beating her children. From the age of 7, he was sexually abusing her young daughter Sarah. And this would progress over the years into rape. Martin Smith was a failed stage performer. He appeared briefly on a UK TV programme, Britain's Most Haunted, as a psychic. He'd worked in entertainment personnel in a well-known campsite. Basically, he failed at this job and wouldn't counter doing anything else. The family had no money, and it would seem from some reports, Lianne turned to prostitution. With her total emotional and psychological dependence growing on Martin Smith by the day, Lianne was quickly isolated from her family. It doesn't seem that she had a terribly close relationship with her birth family. I can't seem to find out anything about her first children, Chris and Sarah's, natural father. There seems to be no reports about him whatsoever. So the family would move around quite a lot. They didn't have any money. At one point, apparently they were staying in a caravan. They were so short of money. And yet still Lianne thought this was appropriate for her two children. The children would become home educated, taking them off the radar of both education and social services. And if you move across counties, although social services and educational and medical information is meant to go with you, this unfortunately rarely happens. So the children slipped off the radar. In July 2004, Lianne would have a third child, Rebecca, known as Becky. And a few years later, when Sarah, Lianne's oldest child, was able to go to university, she finally felt free of the clutches of her stepfather, Martin Smith. Not long after she went to university, Chris, her younger brother, was kicked out as well. Sarah was alarmed at the thought of young Becky being alone and unprotected, and her worst fear was that the abuse that she had endured for years would start on her younger half-sibling. So she went to the police. On the 1st of November 2007, Martin Smith was arrested and taken in for questioning. A few days after his questioning and subsequent release on bail, he, Lianne, and Becky fled to Spain. They would first of all turn up in Barcelona, and knowing that there was a warrant out upon him, they would keep a low profile for 2.5 years. Again, there was lots of moving, and there's some reports that Lianne worked as an English teacher using a false name. And there are also reports of, again, Lianne being sent out by Martin Smith to prostitute. In June 2009, Lianne would have her 4th child, Daniel. And it would seem that, although fairly transient, the family did settle enough that Daniel was in daycare and Becky had started a preschool. In 2010, there was a break-in at the Smiths' property, and the Spanish police were duly called. This was Martin Smith's downfall. They were able to recognise him on a European arrest warrant, and he was arrested and quickly extradited back to the UK to face the charges from 3 years ago of sexual abuse and rape of a child. 8 days after Martin Smith was arrested and extradited back to the UK, Lianne Smith would take the children from Barcelona to the popular tourist town of Lloret de Mar. She would book into a local hotel on the 15th. She would spend 3 days playing with the children, taking them to the beach, treating them to ice creams. And on the 17th of May, at around 9 p.m, she killed her children. I'm not going to go into the details of how she killed her children. The following day, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, she walked down to the hotel reception and calmly told them, "I've killed my children. Can you please call the police?" The police that attended noted, "When we arrived, she seemed far away, as if she was on another planet. And when her statement was recorded, it was noted that she seemed to be speaking in slow motion. She would say, 'My intention was to go, my children and me together.' She said that she tried to kill herself as well. The police think that she tried to suffocate herself, but there were no clear indications of this. She also said that she was increasingly worried that with the situation with Martin Smith in the UK and her still in Spain, she feared that her children would be taken off her. In December 2010, Martin Smith would stand trial in Manchester. He was accused of various sexual offences against a child. And amazingly, Lianne asked and was granted the ability to send a video recording supporting him, where she would call him kind and generous. Yet still, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 16 years. He was taken to Strangeways Prison in Manchester, and a few weeks later, in January 2011, he was found hanged in his cell. His death was certified as suicide. Lianne Smith herself would stand trial for the murder of Becky, aged 5, and Daniel, 11, in June 2012. Her defence counsel initially tried to put an acquittal in on the grounds of her psychiatric disturbance, which is the Spanish equivalent of diminished responsibilities, but this wasn't accepted by the judge or the prosecution. So she stood trial for their murder. She was found guilty. She was sentenced to over 15 years for each killing. The judge would say, "There may have been a minimal amount of planning, but there was intention." And basically, Lianne Smith knew what she was doing when she was taking the life of her 2 young children. Daniel and Becky were buried in a cemetery in Lloret de Mar. Their funeral was only attended by Spanish officials. The Spanish authorities and agencies did what they could for these children, but no family members attended Daniel or Becky's funeral. So, why did Lianne Smith kill her 2 young children, Becky aged 5 and 11-month-old Daniel? When Lianne and Martin Smith met in October 1992, she was perfect for him. He was looking for somebody, by the nature of him, from what I've read. He was controlling, he lacked any kind of empathy. He was only ever after what was good for him. And finding somebody like Lianne Smith, who was vulnerable, who seemed, from what I can gather, to have quite a dependent personality, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. To him, it was a match made in heaven. Add to the fact that she had 2 small children that he was able to coerce and control, and if they displeased him, just by their merest presence, it would seem, he could beat them with impunity because Lianne would not stick up for them. And that's the interesting thing about this case. I want to talk about how Lianne, one, became the person that she did, that she was so susceptible to Martin Smith, and also why she continued that. And it's a terrible case because we've got 2 very young children being killed by the one person in this world that all children should be able to depend on, their mothers, to keep them safe and to keep them well. But she'd already failed to keep her older children safe and well from Smith. I think, as I mentioned, I don't know anything about their father, about her older children's father, whether he was interested in them, whether he made any attempts to see them after they divorced. I really don't know anything about him. But the one person that children ought to be able to rely on completely, to look after them, to keep them safe, to nurture them, to be interested in them, is their mother. And she'd already failed once with Sarah and Chris. Although not inevitable, the likelihood that she was going to let her 2 subsequent children down was pretty high considering the circumstances. So they meet in 1992. He quickly moves in with her. Seemingly before that, they're from the northeast Tyne and Wear area of the UK, and there was lots of moving around. Now remember, this is Martin Smith, a man who's full of pent-up frustration and anger and arrogance, and throw in the usual narcissistic traits that he seemed to have in bucket loads. And these 2 poor older children of Lianne's didn't stand a chance against him. He was abusive to the older daughter, Sarah, and because he fancied himself as some kind of stage hypnotist, apparently she said afterwards that he would hypnotise her or go through the motions of hypnotising her. And she wasn't hypnotised. Hypnotism is a suggestibility. And when you know that you're going to be abused by somebody, the last thing you are is relaxed enough to have something suggestible put to you. But she would go along with it from an early age. She said that she would just go along with it because it would get the abuse over quickly, and he would then leave. He would say to her afterwards, thinking that he was hypnotising her, and say this is how arrogant he was, that he thought that he was putting Sarah, a young girl, into a hypnotic state. And he would say to her afterwards, counting backwards, "Oh, you're awake now. What just happened to you?" And she would again just make up what she thought that he wanted to hear, which was, "Oh, yes, I just had a really nice dream." And satisfied at that, he would then leave her alone for a short time. But because that was going on, obviously he was emboldened to escalate the abuse against her. And it started off with gross sexual abuse of her, but then would turn into rape, which carried on for years. And she didn't have the one person that she ought to have been able to turn to listen to her. Right from the beginning of their relationship, Lianne Smith put Martin Smith way above the needs of anybody else. Everything was about him. And one of the reasons that he found her so pliable and, I suppose suggestible. There were some reports about, was she in a hypnotic state all the time she was with him, or was she hypnotised when she killed the children? That's just taking the headlines of him having been on a very small TV programme for a very small amount of time and turning it into a headline. But she wasn't at all, because she was just, from what I can read about her, she seemed to have a highly dependent personality characteristics or personality disorder. And if we think about a dependent personality disorder, it's characterised by a chronic and pervasive emotional and psychological dependence on other people, usually one other. So if we think about, I'm trying to illustrate what a dependent personality might look like, and it's a very needy type of character. It's somebody that has to be told exactly what to do, how to think, how to behave, how to act. And in Martin and in Lianne Smith, Martin Smith found his perfect person to do this. She would have depended on him completely and totally and utterly to satisfy and meet her emotional, physical, not financial, because, well, I suppose you could say financial, because he organised her, if it is indeed true, her prostitution. There's an interesting add-on to Lianne Smith's murder case, because apparently when DNA evidence came back, Martin Smith wasn't the natural father of either Becky or Daniel. Apparently, when hearing this, Lianne Smith just blew it. She was in hysterics about it. And ultimately, because I think it didn't really make huge amounts of difference to either the prosecution or the outcome, I think they agreed, rather than having to do further tests. And remember, these poor children had been buried with each other, but essentially by themselves. I don't think they wanted to have to go there and redo tests, so they agreed that it could have been a laboratory error, and it was struck off that Martin Smith wasn't their natural father. It was, I don't know quite the Spanish legal system, obviously, but something was put that he potentially was their father, and that seemed to satisfy her. The suggestion, of course, being that if Martin Smith wasn't their natural father, then were they both born out of Lianne's time as working as a prostitute, a sex worker? So maybe that's why she was quite so explosive. But throughout, the one theme that Lianne Smith has, apart from the neglect of her children's welfare, the one major theme that she seems to show throughout the entire time, from the moment that she met Martin Smith, was he became her everything. And he had to tell her what to do, where to go, how to work. At one point, apparently, she was working in the Children's Social Services Welfare Department of a local council in the UK. It seems extraordinary. While her older child had been so dreadfully sexually abused, her second child, Chris, had been beaten on a regular and terrible basis by Martin Smith, and the likelihood of him carrying on that abuse to further children was quite high. And yet she's working, ironically, in a department that was meant to be helping children. And it may have been that, and seeing what she saw there, that made her believe that her children would be taken away from her. Add to that, Martin Smith probably telling her that as well, because if there was ever any time where she didn't want to do what he wanted her to do, that would probably be his go-to. Well, if we go to the authorities, if we do anything, then the children will be taken away. Yet more children will be lost to you. And she was paralysed by that fear. She believed it. And when part of her defence was that she said that she took her children away, they said about a level of premeditation, but it seems quite high. It seems quite a high level as far as I'm concerned, because she took her children away. She talked about giving them the best 3 days of their lives, as if that's what she was always planning. And I think that was probably reflected in her sentence. Apparently, Lianne and Martin Smith had a suicide pact that if they were ever parted, they would both commit suicide, presumably always knowing that she would take the children with her. So Lianne Smith seems to have a very dependent personality, and in Lianne, Martin found the perfect person to be able to coerce, to be able to use all the things that he did. Now, where does a dependent personality come from? Now, people with a dependent personality, they place the needs and the opinions of others, Martin Smith, above everything. I've mentioned that. In some of the worst cases that I've known over the years, they can't even make a decision about whether to have a cup of tea, whether to buy an orange or an apple. And I remember one particular lady that I used to see, we'd talk about her buying an apple, and then she couldn't, she'd make the decision about an apple, and then she couldn't make the decision about which apple to buy because she was so dependent on other people telling her what to do. It's not the most common of personality disorders, but I think you can understand the theme here. We can all be a bit indecisive about things and not be able to know what we're going to have for our supper, say, for instance. But when that decision has to be made by another person because your anxiety is so high, you can see the symbiosis of the relationship here. And that's why when her young child was coming to her saying, look, I'm being beaten by this man, she couldn't deal with the fact that she may have to do something for her young child because she might lose the person that she has been wanting, if you like, to be dependent on. Like a lot of personality disorders, causes are, it's a spectrum, but often it's about your own, so Lianne's own parental neglect. And this could seem to be borne out by a situation at Lianne Smith's trial. Apparently her own mother was subpoenaed by the Spanish courts to come over and make some kind of character reference for her. She didn't come. The Spanish courts apparently were a bit perplexed by this because obviously if you're subpoenaed, you're meant to come. And they seemed to just drop it. And I think there was some kind of written evidence instead. But her own mum couldn't make it over to Spain to talk about it. Perhaps she was so appalled and disgusted with her own daughter, she didn't want to. But it would seem that, from what I've read, there doesn't seem to be huge amounts of a good relationship or any relationship. Apparently, she didn't even tell her family about Daniel being born. They knew about Becky, although never having met her. The last time, in one of the reports that I read, the last time that Lianne saw her own family was in 1995, just 3 years after she had met Martin Smith. And again, and I say this all the time and I don't apologise for saying it, that is the most classical tactic of an abuser, is to isolate them. So he not only isolates her from her family, however fractured that may be, it's still a source of support for her, but he isolates her from her country. He takes her to Spain, believing that, believing, and for 2.5 years this was verified, that you could get away, you could go to Spain, you could lie low, and eventually the British police will give up on trying to look for you. But because of the horrendous crimes, of course, that he had committed against Lianne Smith's older daughter, Sarah, they weren't going to do that. So why was Lianne Smith so vulnerable to Martin Smith? Again, I've tried to research this. I can't seem to find out anything much about her background. I would suggest it's probably a very distant parental relationship. Her mum or family members didn't turn up to a trial. Nobody went to Becky and Daniel's funeral. So that's not to say that they're heartless and unloving, but maybe there's just something there that was missing, as it seemed to be around the trial, but also maybe there was something there missing from Lianne's childhood. And that void that I talked about is just waiting to be filled. And that's where the horror that was called Martin Smith came into the family. So she loses the chief manipulator of her life, the man that for years has been telling her what to do, what to wear, how to think, and if to be believed, who to sleep with. So she's completely at adrift, and she takes the children off, knowing what the outcome is going to be. And also, I think there's an element of punishment, that Lianne Smith is punishing society and authorities for Martin Smith's trial. Apparently, when her daughter would say about what was happening, she just wouldn't believe her. She blamed her daughter for the situation that they were in. She would claim that Martin Smith was innocent at all times. Remember when he had his trial, she sent a video character reference saying that he was kind and generous. She was so enamoured and she was so under the thumb of Martin Smith, but she didn't. The interesting thing is, and this is where I think the personality issue comes in, she didn't do anything at all to stop herself. regardless of what was going on around her, whether she certainly wasn't deranged, so she knew what was going on around her, but she didn't do anything to stop herself being so, they used to call it Svengali, to be so completely under the control of another person. And she talked about having given her children the best 3 days of their lives, as if that's some kind of justification for killing them at the end. So it's a punishment against society, against authorities for Martin Smith's trial and subsequent jailing. Remember, she's blaming her daughter for this, her daughter that went to the authorities because she was worried about Becky. Lianne Smith killing the children is perhaps her way of punishing the society for not listening to her, for taking Martin away and leaving her on her own for the first time in years. She had to make decisions. She had to think about what she was going to do. She wasn't being told all the time. And that's where the dependent personality comes in, of course, because you want to be told all the time what to do. You want to be informed about what your thoughts are, what your behaviours are. And if you come from a background that is fractured and unattached, then finding somebody that is going to fill that void, because it's the void of emotional development that has never taken place, and finding somebody that's going to fill that void, which Martin Smith did for Lianne Smith, was absolutely crucial to her. She put that above everything else in her life. She appears to have no family and so certainly no social support that I can find. So that's where he filled in the gap. And that's why it's so important that when we look after and parent our children, that it's a broad breadth approach. We don't just do the good things for them. We don't just do the tellings off the bad things for them. It's a broad thing. So they have that attachment and that understanding of what's right and wrong. And then no way is somebody going to then be able to slide in there and fill the void that we as parents have left. So I think that's what was going on for Lianne Smith. So she had a highly dependent personality. As he's the Svengali, she's the manipulated, and he's in her head all the time. I think, as I said, him suddenly not being in there would have thrown her to complete apoplexy. Remember the suicide pact that they'd agreed on some time before. So she's thinking, right, how do I carry this out and make sure that the children come with me? But throughout, I think the thing that we do really need to remember is that she's shown little responsibility for any of her children. The outcome for all of her children could have been completely different. The other thing that was mentioned about this, it's not the traditional kind of arena that you would think of about this, but some commentators mentioned about Stockholm syndrome. This is where a captor and captives form this kind of strange, incongruent bond between them and psychological alliance. And I think there's a little bit of that going on. It's not in its traditional sense. Just as an aside, Stockholm syndrome, if you're interested, came about from a failed bank robbery in Stockholm, of course, in 1973, where I think it was about 5 or 6 days, the captors ended up holding on to the people in the bank, or some of the people in the bank. And throughout that time, just by normal communication, they formed relationships, if you like, just by being able to speak to one another. But it's not the whole Patty Hearst thing that we think of when we think about Stockholm syndrome, where you actually take on the cause, whether it's political or financial, of your captors. That's a completely different type of syndrome, but we'll talk about that perhaps another time. So it wasn't so much a psychological alliance, which Stockholm syndrome was, it was a psychological dependence. That's what was generated and cultivated by Martin Smith from the moment he read, even before they met, I would hazard a guess, but from the moment that he read Lianne Smith's profile from the dating agency in 1992, he knew exactly what he wanted, and he got exactly what he wanted, which was total and utter dependence on him, regardless of anything else that was going on in her life. I should point out that Lianne Smith's older daughter, Sarah, waived her right to anonymity, which is the perfect right of every single victim of sexual abuse in the UK. but she wanted to get the story out there. And unfortunately, the way that the media works, unless they can properly put a name and a face to a story, sometimes they aren't always interested, regardless of what horrors may have gone on as well. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and I do hope you found the analysis interesting. Listening about children being killed is never an easy topic to cover, let alone listen to. But if I could please ask you to like and subscribe and share, and please feel free to comment below. It's always interesting to see what people have to say about certain topics. Until next time, thanks ever so much. Keep safe and goodbye.